Most beginner gardeners think tomatoes are hard to grow, but the truth is if you follow a few simple steps, tomatoes can actually be one of the easiest crops in your garden. In this video, I'm going to walk you through exactly how to grow tomatoes step by step, from seed or seedling all the way to harvesting baskets of juicy tomatoes. So the first thing you want to consider when growing tomatoes is determinate versus indeterminate varieties. The determinate ones are the shorter, bushier type of tomatoes. They tend to be hybrids. And then you have the indeterminate tomatoes, which tend to be bigger, taller, almost tree-like. And those tend to be the heirlooms and the open pollinated varieties. I would say for beginners, it's easier to start with the determinate tomatoes. And my favorite go-to variety for beginners would be Celebrity for the big tomatoes. And then for cherry tomatoes, I'd recommend Super Sweet 100 or Sun Gold. And for beginners, it is easier to do the cherries rather than the bigger tomatoes. Cherries just grow easier, especially in the heat. If you live in an area that has a lot of heat, cherry tomatoes are going to be a lot easier for you to grow. They'll push through the heat longer than the bigger varieties. Another thing to think about when growing tomatoes is the location where you are growing your tomatoes. Every year you should rotate your tomatoes to reduce disease, especially if you've had blight or something similar in your soil as a soil type of disease. You'll want to rotate your tomatoes to a different bed, so that will reduce the disease. Also, pruning appropriately and spacing properly so that the plants have more airflow, that is going to reduce disease as well. In terms of spacing, you want to space your tomatoes at least 1.5 feet apart. Ideally 2 feet is a little bit better. I have them spaced about 1.5 feet apart right here, and it is pretty close, especially for determinate tomatoes, but for heirloom ones you can get away with the closer spacing. And then you also want to think about how much sunlight your tomatoes are getting. So if you put them in a shadier area, you're not going to get tomatoes. So you want to make sure that your bed is getting at least 6 to 8 hours of sunlight every day in order to grow big, juicy, healthy tomatoes. And by the way, it doesn't really matter what type of setup you have for growing tomatoes. You can grow them in raised beds. You can grow them in pots as long as they're big enough. You want at least a 5-gallon sized pot or grow bag to grow a tomato in. That's for one plant. Or you can just grow them in the ground as long as you amend the soil with compost. And that kind of gets into my next point, which is you want to pay attention to your soil quality because tomatoes love rich soil. Now the first thing I do when I'm planting my tomatoes is, of course, you're going to dig the hole, and I usually put in a little bit of fertilizer in there. I use an organic type of fertilizer that's suited for tomatoes. So an example of this would be something like tomato tone. And then as I am planting tomatoes, I add in some compost, and I top off the beds as well with additional compost and mulch, which usually is a type of leaf mulch. But the key is to make sure that your soil is well draining. You don't want waterlogged soil because that's just going to stifle the roots and it's going to cause problems. The plant's not going to produce as well. So it doesn't matter the type of container you have. You just want good soil, and compost is the best way to improve your soil quickly. So the cool thing about planting tomatoes is that you can plant them pretty deep, and it actually improves the health of the plant to plant them deeply. So always dig a nice deep hole, and you can lay the tomato kind of on its side, or you can put it upright as long as you bury it below where you have it in the pot. So dig a deep hole, put it in there, and then cover up the stem, because along the stem is going to grow extra roots. So you'll get a nice thick ball of roots down there if you bury your plant deeply. And additionally, when you go to plant your tomatoes, make sure to prune the bottom leaves along the bottom of the plant so that they aren't touching the soil. It's a little hard when they're smaller, so maybe you might just pick off like 1 or 2 sets of leaves, but as they grow, keep pruning off the bottom leaves. This is going to help prevent disease from splashing up if you water, if it rains and the water splashes soil bacteria onto leaves. It can get disease. So if you remove those bottom leaves, it's going to reduce the chances of your tomatoes getting sick and not producing as well. Another key thing that you have to think about is how you're going to support your tomatoes. So you need to make sure that you either stake them you cage them, or you trellis them. And it's going to kind of depend on the type of tomato variety you have. I have a whole video on how to grow heirloom tomatoes, so you can check that out if you are growing an indeterminate variety. You can use my method, which is a hook and string type of method, or you could grow them up along a trellis. You're just going to need something very tall. I recommend cages for the bushy determinate tomatoes because they have lots of branches that need to rest. Now right here, because these are baby tomatoes, I have them staked. But once it gets warm enough here and the tomatoes start really growing, I'm going to put cages over them. I just have them staked like this so that I can cover them because we still are getting a few frosts. In my area, you have to plant them before the last frost because it gets so hot here. So that's why I have them planted this way. Last year I grew my cherry tomatoes along the fence, so I had them trellised along there, and that worked pretty well. The only disadvantage is if you have a one-sided trellis like that, is that it's harder to get deep in there. So as those cherry tomatoes grew over there, I was having trouble reaching to the back of the plant near the fence and pruning it and collecting tomatoes. And I even got more disease back there. I got some blight, and it was hard to eradicate it because everything was all kind of packed back in there. So I wouldn't recommend growing them up like a fence like that. I recommend using a trellis that is open on both sides. In terms of watering, you want to make sure that you water tomatoes deeply, and if you live in a temperate climate with mild summers, you can probably water them once or twice a week. But if you live in a hot climate like me, you have to water them every day. And you want to give them a nice deep soak, but you want to avoid splashing the leaves, which is why I have drip irrigation here. It makes it a lot simpler to water them every day. But if you do water them by hand, make sure that you're not splashing the leaves. But the one thing I want you to take away from watering tomatoes is to make sure that you water consistently. Because if you don't water consistently, especially in heat, it can cause blossom end rot. A lot of people think that blossom end rot is a calcium issue and that you need to put Tums in the bottom of your planting hole or crushed up eggshells. But that's completely not true. That's just a viral kind of reel kind of thing that you might see like on TikTok. But the truth is, it's actually watering. The plants have a harder time in uptaking calcium if you don't water them enough, especially during heat waves. So make sure you're consistently watering your plants. Now, I've already mentioned a little bit about fertilizing. You want to make sure that you are regularly fertilizing your tomatoes with a liquid fertilizer every 2 to 3 weeks during the growing season. And when you plant the tomatoes, in the beginning, you want to put in some granular fertilizer. So I use something like tomato tone when I'm planting them, and then throughout the season, every other week, I fertilize them with something like Alaska fish fertilizer or a fish and seaweed fertilizer. And you want to dilute that in water and then just give each tomato plant a little bit of that. And in addition to fertilizing, compost makes a great fertilizer. So throughout the growing season, as I am collecting compost out of my compost bin, I have finished compost, I'll just side dress or like sprinkle the finished compost around the bottom of the plant. Now, as far as pruning, I wouldn't stress too much about pruning. I've seen a lot of videos on Instagram and stuff talking about how you need to prune all the suckers and stuff to get the best harvest. Pruning the suckers is good for the indeterminate varieties because it helps you grow them straight up like a tree. But for most tomatoes, especially if you're growing determinate varieties or if you're trellising them differently, you're not using something like that string method, you want to leave the suckers alone, honestly. Honestly, by leaving the suckers, you're going to get more fruit. So if you prune the suckers off, you're going to get less fruit. So what I do is I just prune areas where it's starting to get bushy. So don't stress too much about the pruning. Just focus on improving the airflow for your plants. Now we're going to get to the fun part, which is harvesting tomatoes. So this is the part everybody looks forward to, is harvesting those big juicy baskets of tomatoes. You want to wait until the tomato is turning fully red if you're growing a red variety or whatever color it is. You want to make sure that it has that full color and it's slightly soft. So if you're growing like a green variety of tomato, you can tell because it'll start to get soft. And make sure to pick your tomatoes regularly to encourage more production. And I also want to tell you that if you live in a hot area like me, expect your tomato plants to stop producing in the middle of the summer when it gets really hot, like July, August, into the beginning of September. That's completely normal. So a few beginner tips before I close here are: make sure to mulch to retain moisture. Plant basil nearby, which is a good companion plant for tomatoes, and marigolds as well. Make sure to watch for hornworms and make sure to rotate your tomatoes every year. If you're starting a garden this year and want more step-by-step help, I have a homesteading and gardening community where I share garden planning guides, beginner tutorials, and you can ask questions anytime. I'll put the link to my school community down in the description if you want to join us. I hope you enjoyed this video, and please be sure to like and share this video as well as subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you guys in the next one.